level of physical existence is undetermined. But in the process of its prolonged existence, it maintains the most optimal state of physical being. But mentally, it is completely intertwined and undifferentiated from the environment. The environment is the host of the mind. You see, not just at the particular level that the mind resides in the being in which characterizes it, but rather mind has a field quality to it. It's a force field. Whitehead calls it force field. And a force field goes into describing the fundamental elementary mechanics of an event particle. And we were talking about event particles as being these aggregates of undefined set of relations that discloses a set of defined objects. And so when you look into an aggregate, you see a bunch of, undifferentiated character, like it's just, they're all there and they're all material and they're all taking up space and a position and a circumference in space-time. But you go into that and you realize, well, that was just space disclosing a set of related entities. And in their relation, they look like one thing, but as components of that relation, in and of themselves, a component that potentially discloses a relation, as that identity, it is no longer an object in the sensible sense of the word, meaning by our organs of sensation. Where did they come from? They just disappear into being. Do you know things disappear into being? One force field enters another force field, and they become the same disclosure of a field. And the interactions of subatomic particles, which we take to be the operations of ordinary matter, are disclosed by these greater set of internal relations. We said greater and internal, what seems to be two unrelated concepts. In the context of the definition of a relation, the connection between greater and internal requires investigation. And the connection between these two variables of the proposition ultimately suppose that the term greater is a measure extending beyond a particular measure. It's a measure which acts as the whole, of which a part of it is only a component or a part making up the whole, or in other words, the whole is always greater than the part. What an intuitive measure. The whole is greater than the part. The part is numerous because it contains the nature of a thing to be a part. The quality for a thing to be a part, you see, for a thing to be particular, that's one category. And we contrast that with the other category of greater, meaning in terms of size or relation, that there is more than one relation happening simultaneously, and that is undefined. And in that rigidity, you see, we have the magnitude of going into the larger scale aggregates, the larger scale aggregates. At that domain, at that dimensional magnitude, the inverse happens. And we ultimately also become the most minute and smallest measure of constituting all macro scale objects. Apperception, let's say, The conclusion made by the culmination of all your senses coordinating together to provide you with the best interpretation of reality, the best measure of what's going on. But Whitehead says that this measure, which define objects like bits and matter, are obviously not the most fundamental and internalized within them. Meaning at every part and at every measure of space and time, wherever you look, wherever you can observe, wherever you can see, and in what way you can see it, meaning if you go microscopically into the object, you see that there are particles, and those particles behave similar to the dimension in which it sustains, which is the macro stuff, but more, we can't say beyond, but rather completely different than that, is what Whitehead calls parallel, the definition of what it means to be parallel, which he defines in three ways. One, parallel means for a thing to be included in another, or the exclusion itself as taking as a variable that constitutes the relation of two things, or it's the pure exclusion of two things from one another. You see? It's either the absolute distinction that things never interact and are completely non-related with one another, which is what in our science take to be parallel. We have two straight lines going up and never intersecting. We say, well, parallel universes, they can never interact because they're parallel. But in that definition is the relation between two things that can never interact as forming a relation, as forming a bond. Their bond is ultimately not their immediate interaction, but rather their non-immediate, or we say internal because that's from our observation we go into the object, or rather as the nature of a thing sustaining it is not outside of it, it's always, away from its observation of it, or away from its conception, the cause of the conception, where the idea comes from nowhere. You see, where the idea comes from nowhere. And this is what we're trying to say, is that the form that these parallel dimensions that disclose a set of indeterminate relations, each forming a determinate and definite form, the total relation of all these observed differences, you see, the difference between all of them itself is that they integrate as some kind of geometric hypercube. It's like this. Whitehead says that all moments are instantaneously occurring simultaneously. And this is the content of the parallel dimension. The content of one aspect of an inverse component within a parallel relation, you see, an aspect of it enters into an infinite continuity of preceding moments, or rather preceding moments. They precede by going after any defined moment, and that defined moment is the present, what is constantly happening at every instance. And this forms a field, it forms a plane. It becomes distributed on a plane like some kind of like, the point is that these aspects of reality that we say are kids or this event and that event and the event I'm in right now and every possible event that will happen to you at a continuity from a duration beginning from an initial point to an end point. You know, in the indeterminate sense of that transaction, an event particle can only occupy one and only one position in space that is not occupied by some other event particle that can only occupy one and only one place in space. And that ultimately is the definition of position. You have a place in space, a place relative to a set of other objects that we take to be the total disclosure of the content of the event. An event is always a scene of things. There's always a bunch of different things happening, you see. That's just the way it is. It's always this field. But this field ultimately is disclosed by a more fundamental dimension. And this dimension is bigger than it, and the event is smaller within it. And so Whitehead defines an event particle in three ways. He defines an event particle by, first, its position. You see, a position is not what it is as a solid, thing, moving about in three-dimensional space. In three-dimensional space, is the external domain in which it can behave and have observed a set of modifications to a sequence. Or rather, the modifications observed each take on a variable in what Whitehead calls a neighbor, or rather neighboring fields of events. Neighboring fields of events. Wow! Fields of events, and each event is simultaneously happening. It's just because your mind takes on a discrete measure in only one and single event at a time, because it has to take that discrete particle state. We call that measure a particle state. It's happening at each event only at one moment in time. We call that an instance, like it's just instantaneous, but in a differentiated, determined manner. Where the determination is occurring and in what sense it's happening, that is particularized and made into a finite and definite set of interactions rather than an indefinite. That is made by the observer, we call, which is just one aspect of the innate nature of all things. Because one aspect is the object, which is by nature not the observer, which is what is observed or what is conceived into existence by the observer at a different moment in time than the moment in time when the object exists prior to the observer. So the object is there, but it's only there for the observer when the observer is conceiving it to be there. And it's this complex process of grasping the sequential, the thing that just missed the point of identification. Let's not try to capture something that we can't catch. So we revert back to the discussion where an event particle is characterized by three features. One we said is its position, which really is not its position, but rather the capacity for a set of undetermined relations to occupy a form relative to a different process, also resulting in some discernibly different form. And we have this dynamical process happening, and we call within every instance of that is a position, because something different is happening, something that no other thing is happening at that exact place that it's happening in. And this is not extended outwards, because outwards you see things just happening as they are. Macroscopically, things are always just ongoing, moving out and about. You just land on a village and it's like, oh, just life is moving out and about. And you zoom out of that, that becomes just one possible moment. It's just you can't zoom out enough to see that one moment is just part of a preceding millisecond differences of its neighboring moment, which has a parallel existence. They never completely become each the other or one another. They are always slightly differentiated, but forming the relation that one comes after another, and now there is a continuity of an happening, of an occurrence, of an event. And the other aspect of the event particle does the position, it does the relation outside that position, which takes on a distinct form, which is the pure division of two moments that can never be exactly in the same position as the other. And these are the dynamics of a non-physically interacting components, or rather entities in nature. An indirect interaction of natural entities, or extra-natural, or whatever you want to call them. We say quantum, because quantum is just a pure measure of the discrete occurrence of an innumerable set of relations. That's what it fundamentally is. It's a quantum. It's a point in space and time, space-time. That space-time relation is itself a distinct point. It's a dimension. And Whitehead says the fucking craziest thing that blew my mind. He said these ultimate dimensions are the primordial and preliminarily basic relations of dot, plane, line. Those basic geometric relations are at the grandiose, biggest scale of existence. And they're it's just a sheet of paper, you can see through it, transparent, and it's dimensionally infinite, because you can infinitely go within and it extends outwards. And it's this pure substance. And it's pure in the sense of not being contaminated by any particular event, but maintains the ultimate dynamics that can go into constituting any particular event. It's the possible motions that is implicit in every object, in the relation of objects forming a force field that we call an event. The distinct configurations of all these different objects at each an instantaneous spatial point, but each occupying a different moment or a different position or a place in the field of interaction, of all of them simultaneously happening, concurring at once. What does Whitehead call it? He calls it congruency. Congruent. Each thing is happening and each thing is doing its own thing while every other thing is doing its own thing, and somehow the interaction of each is determined by that mere independent fact. What a weird interaction. And sometimes they collide and one annihilates the other and one is inevitably annihilated. And it takes on these fields where one just comes into the other and one disappears away from the observer's point of view, and that's a different field. That's altogether different field, because although it's physically within the same dimension, it's always not in the same place of the observation, or rather the observer's mental dimension. His conception of things. Conception meaning things coming in and out of being. They're outside of that conception. Oh shit. And it's just happening. Always, you're walking within it. Event, particle, anything can happen at all time. Well, all things are certainly happening in every way.